Hi, I'm the Space Quest historian, and let's talk about Space Quest 2. We're going to be taking a look at some different versions of Space Quest 2 for different platforms, but first let's just set a quick baseline here and have a look at the IBM PC version of Space Quest 2 from 1987, good old 1987. This is the version I'm assuming most of you watching this video have played or have seen being played on YouTube. This is the what I would almost call the standard version of it. This is the version you get when you buy the game on GOG or Steam, or if you had one of the collections on CD-ROM from the 90s. This is pretty much the de facto standard version of Space Quest 2, and as you can hear, we've got the lovely PC speaker music in the background, and we've got a nice low-resolution EGA 16-color graphic. It looks really good for its time. I think even those awful people who would go so far as to say Space Quest 2 sucks would have to agree that of the two AGI Space Quest games, that would be 1 and 2, Space Quest 2 is by far the looker. It is a pretty damn gorgeous game, all things considered, with the amount of detail Mark Crow had to work with in the 160 by 200 resolution, with the color palette, again the 16-color EGA palette being top of the line in 1987, and there are a lot more of these lovely little close-ups and talking heads and animations, and the graphical detail is just improved. It's just that much better than its predecessor, as well it should be. It is the sequel after all. It's supposed to kick things up a notch. So anyway, I think we get the idea. This is the IBM PC version. Now let's have a look at the Amiga 500 version. Okay, as we can see, the amount of fucks Sierra gave the Amiga back in the late 80s can really only be counted on an amputated hand. Again, this is a bare minimum conversion that just looks and sounds a lot like the IBM PC version, even though the Amiga just has an abundance of benefits that they could have employed, that were in their capabilities to employ, and they just chose not to. The soundtrack we're listening to is again comparable to the Tandy 1003 voice chip of the PC version, and they could have gone in and done like a real orchestral score if they wanted to, and as we're about to hear later on in this episode, was very much within their capabilities from just an audio design standpoint. They didn't. They just chose to use the bleeps and bloopsies kind of chiptune-y soundtrack. As you can see, the color palette is a bit more refined. The Amiga had 32 colors to work with instead of the EGA 16 from the IBM PC version. So you'll see the text there, place Xenon Orbital Station 4, is in this sort of tan-ish color, but for some reason the space station is still this lovely shade of hot pink. Roger's face is also more of a flesh-colored. Of course, you're not gonna be able to see that because he's gonna be wearing a spacesuit in a second here, and somehow, and I don't know how they did this, but somehow, even when you crank the speed up too fast, which I do in a moment here, somehow the game just runs slower. Like, it runs really slow. Now, granted, this is an emulator, and I am running this on not being an expert on the Amiga or anything, but what I think I've set it to is just a stock Amiga 500. So it doesn't have any extra bells and whistles, and it's running off the floppy drive. But again, if you had a 286 in 1986, like an IBM PC 286, Space Quest 2 ran fantastically. there were no slowdowns. There were no like the transitions between the screens didn't take overly long, and here it's just the animation is just slow, and sometimes between screens the animation gets noticeably slower for some strange reason. About the only good thing I can say about the Amiga conversion is this lovely screen transition that just pixelates in and out. I think that's really rather nice. And as you can see, I'm actually trying to control Roger with the Amiga mouse. Well, actually, now I'm just trying to look at the watch, which you can't do inside the airlock. I should have known this. I'm supposed to be the historian, but bullshit, I'm not. And now I'm actually using the arrow keys to control Roger and being slightly flummoxed by the, okay, here we go, fast speed. Is this really that fast? This is more like normal speed for the IBM PC, I feel. But anyway, so I'm using the arrow keys to move around, and I'm being a little flabbergasted that when you press a key, Roger moves, but you have to hold the key down. Now on the IBM PC version, you press the direction key, let's say right. You press right, and he starts moving. And you let go of the key, and he keeps moving until you press the key again. But on the Amiga, you have to hold down the direction key, which actually makes the root monster puzzle a lot easier to navigate, because you don't have to constantly hit the same direction key twice to make Roger stop or anything. So the root monster is a lot simpler. And again, not being an Amiga expert, I'm not entirely sure if this is just down to the emulator, emulating a joystick. Because I would imagine if you tug in a direction on a joystick and the dude just keeps walking off into the distance until you yank the joystick in the same direction again, that would be a little infuriating. So I might just put it down to that, but I'm not an expert. I don't know. I went back and checked, and Space Quest 1 behaves in the same way. So I don't know why I didn't mention that in the previous episode. But again, not an expert, not a professional either. So I think that's about what we have to say about the Amiga version. Again, not a great conversion. It's really just bare bones. It's just the exact same game, except it runs slower and it sounds really terrible, at least from what you would expect the Amiga to sound. This is just bad. So instead, let's have a look at the Atari ST version. Now, in the previous video I did on Space Quest 1 on different systems, I mentioned that the Atari ST was popular in North America, not so much in Europe, and a few people wrote to tell me that, in fact, it was very popular in the UK, but the UK is not really part of Europe anymore, now is it? And I reiterate, all my friends when I was growing up in the late 80s all had Commodore 64s, their bigger brothers had Commodore Amigas, and some of the really fancy shitheads had 286s and 386s. And then, adolescence hit, and we all got 486s, and we started playing Doom. That's kind of, that was how, we grew up. So I've never seen an Atari ST, didn't even know one existed back then. So anecdotal, I know, but still. Anyway, the Atari ST version of Space Quest 2 is, again, more of the same. It's it's a lovely conversion, I guess. I'm not really sure just how hot shit the Atari ST was in comparison to the IBM PC. I know it had a better sound chip. I know it was actually capable of doing some sampling, some sampled digitized sounds. Graphically, it also had a bigger color palette. As you can see, the hot pink has been toned down a bit, but this is still low-res graphics, and it's funny because you can see in the transition, I don't think there's a transition coming up from the screen to the next, but let's just see. Come on, load. No transition. But anyway, when the transition plays, I think after this log-on screen, we're gonna get one. All right, fuck it. There. You see that one? That one. The pixels are a lot tinier, which would indicate that the resolution that the Atari ST is capable of is much bigger than what Space Quest 2 was drawn in. So we're still dealing with some low-res stuff. As you can see, the seizure-inducing mouse cursor of Space Quest 1, that little flashing cross, has been replaced with a, dare I say, much more easier on the eyes, white outline black mouse cursor. Again, navigating with the mouse works about as well as you'd expect. Roger doesn't walk around any obstacles. He just goes in a straight line from where you click. It does seem to be a little less sluggish than it was in the previous game, which is a plus. But again, mouse navigation in these old games is really more of a curiosity, and it's not really a good way to play the game. Oh, nice transition again. So anyway, the Atari ST, capable of so much more, but again, despite some excellent work by Corey Cole, once again, the Atari ST version is really just dare I say, a quick and dirty conversion of the IBM PC version with a slightly improved color palette. But again, the sound is not that amazing, and it doesn't hold any amazing surprises when compared to the IBM PC version. So let's kick things into gear and have a chat about the bizarre versions. Okay, so here we go. Space Quest 2 for the Apple Macintosh. Nope, save games still don't work, but I did actually manage to finish all of Space Quest 2 without losing a life, so to speak. So I actually do have roughly 45 minutes of me playing through the entire game on the Apple Macintosh. And yes, I did go a little cross-eyed having to look at all this dithering, black and white dithering, high-resolution dithering. Again, this is one of the more peculiar versions of the game, and this one is even more peculiar, I find, than Space Quest 1, solely because the drop-down menu interface has been greatly expanded for this version. They've really tried to take this text adventure, but now it's also a point-and-click thing, to the next level. And I realized that when I did my Space Quest 1 on other systems video, I kind of skimmed over how the drop-downs worked. By the way, check out this lovely scroll text of the introduction. This is not how it looks on any of the other versions. This introduction scrolls, and it scrolls rather smoothly as well. This version just boggles my mind. But anyway, so what I utterly failed to do in the last episode was to demonstrate this drop-down interfacey thing in any sort of detail. So let's just do that right now. Let's actually go a step back and check out Space Quest 1, the Sarin Encounter, and I'll give you a rundown of how that actually works, and then we'll take a look at the improvements that they did in Space Quest 2. So for a moment, indulge me as we travel back in time. Okay, so here we are on the Arcada. I was told that this is actually how you pronounce it. So as you can see, under Special, we just have the standard how to, set the animation speed. That's how fast Roger walks around, and retype last command and stuff like that. Direction is weird. This is essentially move the character around with in just the most cumbersome way you could possibly imagine, because as you select the direction, Roger will just barrel in that direction until there's actually a stop in the middle of this drop down, but he'll just barrel ahead until he either comes up across an obstacle or gets shot or falls off of something. Anyway, under verbs, we have, the verbs that you can use, but you have to type in the noun. And the verbs are, again, standard definition. They're not context sensitive. They're not sensitive to the location you're in. They're just they're the same, and likewise so is do it. Do it just has a couple of pre-programmed sentences that are very useful, sort of ubiquitously. Like you could use them anywhere in the game. But you can't finish Space Quest 1 by just using the drop-down menus, because the verbs will still require you to type in the noun, and the do it commands are really lackluster, as you can see. It's just look at room, look at man, look at panel, and open a door. And you can't finish the game with just these commands. So that's how Space Quest 1 worked. Now, don't get me wrong, this is still really impressive for the time. Look, I'm trying to search this dude, but there's no way to actually search a dude in with the drop downs. I can, however, try to. Okay, look away, kids. This is just. But anyway, yeah. So Space Quest 1 works this way, and it's very impressive that they did that. But let's have a look at how they did Space Quest 2. Okay, so here we go. Xenon Orbital Station 4. Now, Special does the same thing, but it has a redisplay last message, which is actually really useful, and I haven't seen it in any other versions. Remember, the IBM PC version did actually have drop-down menus, but they were just not as useful as this. Again, the walk menu is just as non-useful as you would imagine. It's the same as it was in Space Quest 1, and there's just absolutely no reason for it. The verb drop-down has been greatly expanded. Other just puts up the fucking type box. But yeah, you've got a lot of them. But now you can do verb, modifier, and noun. So you can actually construct sentences with the drop downs. Again, these are ubiquitous for the entire game. They don't change depending on what location you're in. And then you got do it, which has been greatly expanded as well. You've got open door, push button, speak to man, look at screen. You've got a bunch of shit. You would think that you could get a long way with this. That you could essentially play all of Space Quest 2 as a point-and-click game, finally. You would be very, very wrong. Because as you are about to find out, this is me just trying to look at my watch so I can have a chat with my station commander, but watch is not any of the available nouns, so you have to type that in. You can get by with a lot, and it is fun to try and see if you can, finish the game, or at least, do anything productive with just the drop-down menus. And to be honest, it's look inside, man. Trying to just look through the gaping hole in his abdomen where his intestines used to be. But you can solve some of the puzzles, like this one where you look inside the wrecked craft and you have to press the button. Granted, a lot of puzzles in Space Quest 2 involve just pressing buttons. So that is, of course, a phrase that's more easily accomplished with just the drop-down menu. But no, you can't finish the game even when doing this. It kind of boggles my mind that they would go to such lengths to have these drop-downs when, for the most part, to solve any of the real puzzles in the game, you would still have to type your way through it. I guess it was just a sort of, what the Macintosh is a graphical user interface thing, and God damn it, we're going to do something with it. And I guess you have to commend them for being at least a little forward-looking, because this is sort of a precursor to the point-and-click style of adventure gaming from the 90s. But accomplishing anything in it is really just a chore, and it's fun for a while, but not so much. Anyway, let's move on to the final version, and this one is interesting in a lot of ways, mostly on the audio side. So yeah, let's just look at the inventory screen. Yeah, you can give it and use it, and and it's they tried, didn't they? They tried. But anyway, no, enough rambling about this bizarre precursor to point and clicking. Let's get on with the Apple IIGS version, by far the most gorgeous and impeccable presentation of Space Quest 2 you will ever see or indeed hear. So without further ado. Yes, again, it sounds a little wonky. You have to remember this is an a late 80s computer that's doing far more than you would expect a late 80s computer to do, and it's also running through an emulator, so it probably sounds a little weird, but this is the introduction music to Space Quest 2 the way I would assume that Mark Crow intended it to sound. Now remember, Mark Crow actually wrote the Carlos Escobar did the Apple version. Carlos Escobar is a name you'll recognize from certain Lisa Suit Larry games. He was one of the lead programmers on Lisa Suit Larry 3, I believe. So interesting that he actually gets a credit here. He didn't get, I'm assuming he also did the previous Space Quest 1 conversion, but didn't get any credit for that anyway. So I would assume this is how Mark Crow intended it to sound. Mark Crow composed the music for Space Quests 1 and 2, and Al Lowe actually programmed them into the versions. Now, as far as graphics go, again, the color palette is, well, it's based off the IBM PC version, I would assume, we are looking at something that's more closely related to the Amiga version. There aren't that many differences, once again. Somehow the jungle planets of Labion doesn't lend itself to a lot of changes like the desert planet of Corona from Space Quest 1 did. Space Quest 1, we had the bizarre pink sky that was replaced by a more realistic looking orange sky, but for Space Quest 2, you do have a lot of blues, and the pink shade is not as scary as it is in the IBM PC 16 color EGA, but more or less the graphics look the same in the different versions. But here's the kicker. Let's get into this. So Space Quest 2 on the Apple IIGS has an actual soundtrack. I'm not kidding. It does. Would you stop fiddling with the menus? God damn it. It actually has a soundtrack, and there are a lot of bits of music in this version that aren't in any other. So let's just not talk to this asshole and move on to the first one, which really surprised me. Okay, remember this bit where these spores, if you kick them, Roger gets paralyzed, but eventually he gets up again? Okay, let's just pause here for a second and play the IBM PC version, the standard version of what happens. Okay, so Roger walks up to the spores, he kicks them, and he does a merry little jig and falls over. And he actually falls face first over in a bunch of other spores, but don't worry, he's fine. And now he just sort of lies there in complete silence, and actually a frightfully long time passes before it wears off and he gets back up. And I think most players, certainly myself when I was younger, would just sit here and go, did I die? Did they forget to put in a death message? What the fuck's going on? And I would restore a game because, obviously you've done something bad. But here's what happens when you kick one of the spores in the Apple IIGS version. Well, first of all, we have this lovely, charming, digitized cough sample and a sweet little lullaby plays. So the game actually gives you an indication that something is happening. Now, this doesn't happen in any of the other versions. I've checked. I've kicked many of these tiny little spores, and I was having a great time doing it all the time. But he's just, I'm even poking him with the mouse. He's going to wake up in just a second as the jingle finishes playing. There we go. And the paralysis wears off and everything's back to normal, and Roger is off to get himself killed some other way. And that took a lot shorter than in any of the other versions, I think. Also, Vohol's theme sounds decidedly more kick-ass. I mean, let's just compare that to the IBM PC version. Or for that matter, the Amiga version. God, Sierra, what did the Amiga ever do to you? Even the swamp creature that attacks Roger in the swamp here gets its own music theme. And the friendly little pink dudes get their own jazzy combo number. And there's even some exciting escaping the asteroid music, hampered only by the loading times of the system. Isn't he adorable? I just think the Maromatic is so adorable. But anyway, this music now plays. There we go again, loading again. So the music will start and stop every time you load a new screen. But while that adorable robot is chasing you through Vohal's asteroid, it goes completely silent until you walk through this portal here and loading. You get a nice little klaxon sound effect that's not at all annoying or infuriating in any sort of way. But we're not quite done with music yet. Here's the biggest surprise of all. Once you actually finish the game, you are rewarded with... well, more of this klaxon bullshit, but anyway, stick with it. It turns out that there's actually a completely alternate end credits piece of music than the opening credits piece of music. Now, you've heard the opening credits piece of music earlier, but I will play it for you again. But let's just have a listen to the end credits music, which has bits in it I've never even heard before. Now, just to compare that, I went back and used the cheat option, or Easter egg really, to bring up the secret ending, 255 out of 250 points, and the original theme will play. Rousing. But not only that, there are some interesting sound effects like I'm not sure why the cave squid was laughing at us, but it was, and there's that. However, the sound it makes as it is chewing on your still living screaming corpse is decidedly more terrifying. This big guy doesn't take any shit when you yell at him. And Monkey Boy here seems appropriately disgusted to find his lunch sort of sailing away into the distance. And somewhere between versions, the glowing gem learned how to play the harp. But we can't let ourselves get too complacent. I mean, even though the Labion Terrorbeast mating whistle sounds appropriately fluty, the actual Labion Terrorbeast sounds a bit like a dentist drill. And perhaps most disappointingly of all, Roger cold-bloodedly murdering a person with a jockstrap makes no sound whatsoever. But all in all, the Apple IIGS version is just miles ahead of the other versions again, but interestingly, if you were to spring for an Apple IIGS back in 1987, you would be paying through the nose. This was not a cheap computer. Pretty much no one had the money to buy one, and it kind of died a slow death, much like Roger tumbling off a waterfall in an underground cavern. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this look through what Space Quest 2 looked like on various machines in 1987. And next time we are, of course, going to take a look at Space Quest 3, which also came out for a variety of different computers. Oh, yeah, well, anyway, so maybe we should just end things here. Yes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around the Chrono Stream. Bye.